Let's talk about grace. So you said earlier that you would like to kind of tweak some people's understanding of grace, and what I'm guessing is when you tweak people's understanding of grace, that's like really core, and you might end up with a lot of backlash and a lot of straw man of what you're saying. So what would you first of all, what is grace, and how has your definition of grace been misconstrued by people who aren't buying into the gospel allegiance method or story?
Yeah. Well, grace is a multifaceted idea, and that's part of what makes it complex, is that it's often been treated as a sort of one-dimensional thing. I would point people to the really helpful work of John Barclay in his book Paul and the Gift, where he unpacks 6 different dimensions of grace. And he shows that grace in antiquity was understood differently than how grace has been understood theologically through the time period of the Reformation and today. So he's really helpful in showing how different ideas of grace have shifted over time. So our basic ideas about grace tend to be that it's actually like when we get something that we don't deserve. That's like our foundational ideas about grace. Interestingly, that's actually not the normal view of grace in antiquity. The normal view of gift giving or graces in antiquity was that you give things only to the people who deserve it. So actually, it's actually the normal idea of grace is the exact opposite almost of in terms of the worldview around the Bible as what it's been come to mean in terms of popular theology. So that's interesting, right? So that actually grace was what you gave to somebody, a gift you gave, but you usually only gave it to the deserving, right? And that actually makes sense to us. Like we don't, when we think about it, like if you're going to give a gift, a grace to, you want to help somebody who's poor and addicted, do you give money directly to them, or do you give it to a homeless shelter? Well, you probably more often will give at least a large amount to a homeless shelter because you realize they deserve it. They're good stewards, right? They deserve the grace. They deserve the gift. So we don't tend to use grace for that. But in the ancient world, it was used to describe deserved gift giving. So that would be just one way in which we've like misunderstood like the foundational nature of gift giving. Another way we've misunderstood it is that grace demanded reciprocation in antiquity. So that if somebody gave a gift, you needed to give a gift back in order to acknowledge the receipt of the gift. Otherwise, you'd rejected it. So, for example, in the ancient world, if you gave me a birthday gift, like that was, let's say, a really nice one, you give me a new car, okay, you're really generous. If I, in response to that, was like, well, that's just really nice of you, and I don't really say anything, and I just kind of accept the gift, I've insulted you as a gift giver. Like what I need to do is I need to keep the circle of grace going. And one way I could do that would be through a public benefit. Like I could like do something to publicly praise you. That's a return gift that is a different kind of gift. I don't need to give you a car in return, but I need to do something to reciprocate the gift giving. Otherwise, I've rejected it. This connects to patron-client relationships in the ancient world and how gift giving worked in patron-client relationships. So again, a major difference would be we tend to think that a pure gift is the best gift, one with no strings attached. That was actually not true at all in antiquity. It was actually the opposite idea. They believed that only grace could only be grace if, in fact, the circle of gift giving was perpetuated in some way. There's much, much more I could say about grace, but that just gives you a little snippet into how ancient ideas about grace were quite different from ideas about grace in a lot of contemporary theology.
And so against that backdrop, so grace as used in the New Testament, basically the same way, or was it pretty revolutionary? What is grace in the New Testament up against the backdrop you just described?
Yeah. So one of the things that is interesting about the New Testament is it does emphasize the unmerited nature of God's gift to us. And this is actually an unusual conception of grace for antiquity, that like God would give it to humanity, even though humanity doesn't deserve it. That's not how ordinarily gift giving works. But this is how it does seem to work in the New Testament. Paul stresses that God gives gifts even though we don't deserve it. I think the problem is that we have tended to abstract that and make grace sort of this plastic thing, when Paul mostly has in view with his grace language the concrete gift that he's already given. What is grace for Paul? It's actually the gospel itself is mostly what grace means. It's that God has acted. He has already given the gift. He's given the gift. And what is the gift? It's the gift of the king and what the king has done and those possible benefits that could accrue to you. What do you need to do to respond to the grace? What do you have to give back to acknowledge the gift? What you give back is your loyalty to the king. Right. And as you give back your faith or your loyalty to the king, then the benefits flow of the gift of God, of the kingship. Right. That's when you receive right standing with God. You receive adoption into his family. So really, it does align with ancient ideas about grace quite well. Other than that, Paul and our other New Testament authors seem to emphasize that God gave this gift to humanity apart from humans deserving it. But it's a historical understanding mostly. Like that gift's already been given. What happens is that it gets dehistoricized, and so that grace becomes this plastic term that means like we could never do anything on our own or something along those lines without violating grace because it's a timeless concept. It's mostly a time-bound concept in the New Testament that God gives his grace at a specific time through Christ events.
So it's not just a vague principle of an excuse to be able to live however you want. It is tied very directly to Jesus' kingship.
That's right.
So we're right to be thinking of grace as both, like not either or, but like unmerited favor from God. So it's by grace you've been saved through faith, that verse. But we do reciprocate. I mean, that's evidence that we actually have faith, right? I mean, we're told to test ourselves. Look at your actions, test yourself. Like that should be your testimony to yourself that you're reciprocating this grace that God's extended to you. Would you say that would be right?
Yeah, that's fair to say. Yeah, when Paul talks about, for by grace you're saved through faith, like, yeah, he actually has already defined grace. If you look back, I mean, those verses always get quoted, Ephesians, the 2:8-10.
Yeah.
Paul actually, a couple verses earlier, actually defines grace, and he defines it in terms of Jesus's exaltation and kingship. Interestingly, there are some connections to the historicity of Christ's saving actions, but yeah, we don't have to choose between the two in the sense that we don't have to say that it's not that I'm not saying that humans don't somehow have deserved God's grace. Obviously they haven't, right? But I think the emphasis in the New Testament is that humanity as a whole was in a deep pickle, right? And God acted in his grace historically 2,000 years ago and offered us salvation in Christ. And then we have the opportunity to respond to that by giving our loyalty or our faith to Jesus as King. And as we respond with loyalty, then the benefits that accompany that kingship flow into our lives. So yeah, it's an unmerited gift, but we're not talking about just an abstract gift as if somehow the problem is that I'm really trying to earn my salvation, but I shouldn't be, and I need to just trust in Jesus. Well, there's some truth to that, but that's not really Paul's point. That's what happens when we dehistoricize that and we misunderstand what grace is. We misunderstand what faith is. We actually misunderstand what works are. If you want more on that, any interested reader, I go through that all in detail in my book, Gospel Allegiance, and discuss this passage, Ephesians 2:8-10, with more nuance.